Hello, everyone, and welcome to this episode of the European People's Podcast. I'm Nathan Shapura, Senior Political Advisor, and today we are pleased to welcome with us Dr. Peter Hefele, new Policy Director at the Wilfred Martin Center for European Studies, for a new series in our ongoing series on the Indo-Pacific. Dr. Peter Hefele is an expert in the region, and we will get to hear from him soon, his own interest and his own expertise and experience for many years in the region. I think it's important first that we note we are recording this on Wednesday afternoon, the 23rd of February, simultaneous, in fact, to an extraordinary summit our EPP President Donald Tusk has convened to discuss the ongoing crisis in and confronting Ukraine. We plan to release this on Friday. We don't know exactly what the world will be like on Friday once this is released, but important just to note that while the crisis is ongoing in the eastern part of Europe, other work goes on. Long-term interests of the European Union remain, and a lot of important work is being done now regarding the Indo-Pacific region. So it's a pleasure to welcome him with us, to welcome you with us today. Thanks so much for being here for this important discussion.
Nathan, thank you very much for having this opportunity to sharing some experiences. It has been more than 15 years in my life and my family's life to be in the region. An impressive and figurative time of my life. I served as a director for Konrad Adenauer Foundation in Shanghai and in Hong Kong as a regional director. It is a region which has undergone tremendous changes the last years. There had been hopes in the beginning of a more democratized Asia. These hopes unfortunately faded out in recent years. We've seen a lot of authoritarian regimes coming off, shrinking spaces. On the other side, it's still a region full of young people, highly motivated, more and more skilled, seeking for representation, for engagement, but unfortunately caught in a cage of old traditional structures, having no hope of really being able to express and make their way up. So this is a bit of a split picture that I have, but I still remain optimistic. And as you mentioned, the importance of the region is beyond any question, and it will rather increase despite the troubles we are currently dealing with in Europe.
So let's maybe back up just a bit. So you, according to your bio, and we should tell listeners who haven't gotten to know you yet, you officially started at the Wilfred Martin Center for European Studies as the new policy director only in January of 2022. You, according to your bio, I saw about 25 years ago, you finished a PhD in economics and economic history, and then about 5 years later joined the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung, serving, as you mentioned, for several years in Shanghai, in Hong Kong, also in Berlin, as the head of the Asia and Pacific office. So maybe one question I might ask you is simply, how did you get interested in the region, first of all, those many years ago?
Well, it was more by accident. I started with the Konrad Adenauer Foundation in the political educations department in the topic of economic policy. But then I wanted to go kind of abroad and widen my view, and Asia was love in first insight.
Well, as you mentioned as well, the importance, the increasing importance of the region. One thing we should say, maybe just to give a bit of context, also as to why we're even having this ad hoc series on the Indo-Pacific in general. In October, we interviewed the former CDU International Secretary and the new Australia, New Zealand, and Pacific director of the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung, Bertel Wenger, is the first in this kind of series. But of course, the European Union in September published its first ever Indo-Pacific strategy. The United States, under President Biden, has just published 1 week ago its own Indo-Pacific strategy. Just yesterday, the 22nd of February, in France, the French presidency convened a group of ministers, EU as well as about 30 Indo-Pacific ministers to discuss. So it's definitely an area of increasing importance for the European Union. One thing I noted in the strategy from September, about 2/3 of the world's population live in the region, about almost 2/3 of global growth, or not global growth, but global production as well, GDP. About 60% comes from the region. So it is a tremendously...
Indeed, you just named the mind-boggling numbers, but it goes way beyond the GDP and the growth and the trade. Asia is the biggest trading partner of the European Commission, even if we leave out the China market, which is dominant still, but other markets in Southeast Asia, Japan, Korea are growing and remain and get more importance as ever. But I think there are other points which we should look for. It is demographic changes. It's not just the sheer number, it's the different dimensions there. We have aging societies, such as in Japan, it's the oldest society in the world. Korea as well, we have one of the youngest societies in Bangladesh and South Asia, so this huge discrepancy. It's the inequality, huge wealth dimensions we have in very rich countries in Northeast Asia, the poorest countries in Southeast and South Asia. We have a huge wave of digitalization. Asians are very, in particular the young generations, are very used and addicted sometimes to digital tools, but that does not mean that they're just taking it as given. They have also critical reflections on privacy, on the wealth and use of these issues. It's not just that we Europeans take very much care about privacy and data protection. It's also a discussion in Asia and what it can really contribute. And of course, a tool of participation in public affairs.
So we've talked about, you've highlighted some of the terms of demographics, growth, population, the ways in which this region is extremely important, of increasing importance. Maybe we could back up a step and I could ask you, why do we think of the Indo-Pacific in general as a region, as a strategic concept, where did this come from? Why do we join these together, Indo-Pacific? What does it mean exactly?
Well, basically, it's not a new term. It has already been invented in the 1920s by a German geographer. Well, he came from the geographic and biological aspects, but it was invented by Shinzo Abe, the then Prime Minister of Japan, in 2006, 2007, and interestingly, during a visit to India. And that already marks very clearly the geographic span. It's from the east of Africa to the Kamchatka Sea in the northeastern Pacific, and includes the southwestern Pacific. So it's way more than we talk about Asia Pacific, which was very much linked and confined to East Asia and Southeast Asia. But now, giving this huge range, it all reflects the thinking and the different thinking about how spaces interact with each other. And it's not like separated areas, the Indian Ocean and the Pacific, but it's one huge territory. And of course, it has to do with the rise of China, because all these neighbors, and if you can imagine this on a map, it is not a kind of containment, a belt of containment, but of course it has reasons why they link up their efforts. India, for example, with Japan, Australia, and Southeast Asian nations. So
there's I think, interesting that we could talk about a historical unity perhaps in the entire space, going back even to Chinese history, which would be an interesting kind of a side discussion. But certainly the security dimension, which you touched on, has become of increasing importance.
It's absolutely predominant, and that triggered the whole discussion. It's less the economic integration yet, because South Asia, for example, is not well integrated. It's all the ships are passing rather by than integrating this economic space that is due to the underdevelopment and lack of openness in South Asian markets. It's different to Southeast Asia and Northeast Asia. They are very well connected and very much around the Chinese markets, of course. They want to get also rid of this unilateral dependency. They want to open. And this is where Europe, by the way, could come in.
So I want to, one thing that caught my attention also in the introduction of the European Union's September 2021 Indo-Pacific strategy was the fact that 7 of the G20 countries come from the region. So it's Japan, South Korea, China, Australia, Indonesia, India, and South Africa, interestingly, because, of course, as you mentioned, this is the Indian Oceans, the Pacific Oceans united in one region. But despite this, Japan in the northeast, South Africa in the southwest of this entire region in the G20, you're saying, economically speaking, there isn't so much.
There's much to be developed. You correctly pointed out that a huge part of the G20 is Asian nations and rising nations. Take the Indonesian case, which had the presidency last year. That clearly shows that they're all performing under their capabilities. I think there's much to develop. It's also due to a lack of connectivity within the region. Europe is a unique example of integrating markets. Asians are far off, despite these new free trade agreements and ASEAN, which is since the end of the 1960s trying to forge forces together, but are far off. It's still the nation state which matters. It's not a sense of unity, community.
So you mentioned ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. That's the Philippines, Indonesia, Malaysia, Singapore, hopefully I'm remembering it well.
Myanmar,
Thailand, Cambodia, Laos, Vietnam.
Currently, well, they are rather out. And if it comes to political action, unity, for example, against China, they are very, very weak, and they are splintered up in different positions towards China, which makes it very difficult to oppose the rising ambitions of China and the reaching out, for example, in the South China Sea.
One of the anchors, I think it's clear from the EU's Indo-Pacific strategy from September, is partnership with ASEAN as a cornerstone of the general strategy. This is a key part of the US's new strategy as well.
But we should not overestimate the strengths and the unity of this organization. It is by far not a European Union in Asia. And it will never be, because the political concepts, also the history, will rather hinder them to integrate more. Even the economic integration is rather done by China than by themselves.
So what do you see as the way forward, let's say, for the European Union in engaging with it? Because I think it's clear with these new strategies the EU has put forward, along with new strategies the United States is putting forward, and other, as you mentioned, new security partnerships like the Quad, United States, Australia, India, Japan. For example, Australia, United States, United Kingdom, AUKUS, the new security partnership. There's a lot of focus being put on the region. People are obviously seeing the importance of engaging. So what would you say are the priorities for the European Union and how to do that?
I think definitely not the security aspect. We want to be present, and some nations in Europe, France, for example, are Indo-Pacific nations. They have territories out there, but we should not overestimate and be very clear about our limitations. There are other fields I think Europe can really make a difference. It's economy. Definitely, we are the largest trading partner. Still, it is scientific research.
Trading partner with
the whole region.
The region in general,
we are, and in particular Southeast Asia and ASEAN. That's why they're very much interested in having a counterweight towards the dominance of the Chinese market. There's a lot of potential in it, but you have huge differences in development. See Singapore, which is the richest and highest developed country. You have poor nations. Still, Indonesia is a low-income country. We have a lot of political instability. So we should rather not overestimate the ambitions and the opportunities. We should have a close eye on it, definitely. And as I mentioned, it's not just economy and trade which matters. They're very much interested in scientific research cooperation, security, not in hard security. That means sending always our fleet or our troops there, but in training, in cyber attacks, for example. This is a very issue. And also in training of military and security, and having an understanding of security in a broader sense, not in a narrow military sense. But these regions are often hunted by disasters, natural disasters, and this is something Europe is engaging and has clearly said that it will be partnering with them.
Other key, as you mentioned, other key parts of the strategy going forward include things like disaster preparedness, or including for things like health pandemics, of course, obviously. A crucial importance right now. Also biodiversity, health of the oceans, and all these sort of critical areas of multilateral cooperation to combat or to confront transnational threats or even crises. Let me go ahead.
And I think that's where both regions have a shared interest in maintaining a kind of multilateralism which is led by rule of law. China, unfortunately, possesses pure force, and we have discussed this with the South China Sea issue, the territorial disputes. Europe is sticking and supporting those nations. They have claims which has been justified by the court, and they alone are too weak. China is playing this old game of divided impera, divide and then rule. And the other thing is that there's a lot of lack of capacity in the region, starting from legal competence to acting on international level. And that's where Europe is a trustful partner, is well respected. We have no hegemonic aspirations coming to that region. We are a trustful partner, and the Asian nations know this. That's why they are very much up with us.
Well, that leads me also to another, to think of another area which is mentioned in I think it was just this week, in fact, in the French presidency statement following the the Indo-Pacific region, a ministerial meeting, and that is highlights the EU's role as a regulator, let's say, a standard setter, maybe is a better word, on things like data protection and digital partnerships, where there's a lot of there's a strong push for.
And it's not just the rather weaker nations in Southeast Asia, Japan, Korea, for example, Singapore, as one of the major economic hubs, are highly interested and really supportive on Europeans' action on global level. So that is a bright future, I see, definitely. If it comes to pure hard security, I'm less optimistic. That remains with the nations in the Pacific. That means the US, in particular, Australia, Singapore, Japan. Europe should be very well, as I mentioned, aware of the limitations of its influence. There are differences among the European nations, by the way. France has a different strategic culture, different to the German, for example. We are very much in trade and economic relations, less in military. There is some developments, defense industries cooperations, for example, with Australia and Singapore, also to some extent with Indonesia, but they will never be the main axis and the main field of cooperation. It is these other fields I mentioned.
Well, that raises maybe two quite provocative questions in my mind that I'd like to maybe finish this discussion with. And the first is, I think, a direct segue to what you were just talking about with security, and especially even with the particularly the French strategic point of view, let's say, and that is with this idea of strategic autonomy or open strategic autonomy, as in the EPP we have written in our documents and many recent documents. Now I think a new term which seems to be used quite a lot to mean perhaps the same thing is the term sovereignty, European sovereignty, a greater focus on European sovereignty. What do you think that means or should mean in the context, let's say, of the Indo-Pacific, open strategic autonomy, European sovereignty?
Well, let me put this from the other side, from the perspective of Asian nations. They are not so much interested in these discussions here. They want to see concrete results and engagement. And this has to be shown first. Asians are very pragmatic. They are less with kind of philosophical discussions and terminology. They want to have clear contributions to very concrete challenges they are facing, be it in natural disaster management, in training, in, standards and open markets and open lanes of communication. And that is where Europe has a stand in its own interest. It will never be able to compete or really complement efforts made by the US or Japan. And the litmus test will be Taiwan, that assume there is an aggressive action, and it's already happening to some extent, then Europe will be very much sidelined. We have no stand in this. We can keep and hold up international norms. That's where we should use every opportunity, be it in the United Nations or in other regional fora. But be frank, even with the current crisis in Ukraine, we see how limited our options are.
I will ask maybe just one final question, or one final big question anyway, and it is a big question and maybe another provocative question, and it's I've been hearing it's been quite prominent recently in debate among American foreign policy experts, the extent to which American foreign policy vis-a-vis China, let's say, in the last 50 or especially 30 years has been successful or not. So was the policy starting with Nixon of engagement with China, was it successful or not? Why not? So there's been a lot of debate even in the last few weeks about this, also of some relevance, I think, with the crisis in Ukraine, as you mentioned. One of the points that has been made is that American engagement with China in the last many decades has contributed to the rise out of extreme poverty of hundreds of millions of people. And then one of the sort of counterpoints, I suppose, is that's, yes, that's excellent, but has that contributed to American security? So I say just that as a kind of a framework. So with regards to European Union engagement in the Indo-Pacific, with regards to economic engagement, connectivity, people-to-people contact, all the various multilateral ways the European Union wants to engage, one of the goals, I think, people would say, is raising the standard of living for people in the region, hopefully also for Europeans. But then the question, I suppose, that first of all, is that the case that will transpire in the Indo-Pacific and in the European Union based on this engagement? And then maybe the bigger question even, how will that benefit Europeans?
Well, basically, going back, say, to the end of the 90s and early 1990s, I think it was for good reasons to engage. It has lifted and there was no alternative. Whether, for example, the WTO access of China was at the right moment because China did not fulfill the standards, but this was mainly a decision made by the United States. And we all had hope in the big markets. Maybe we too lately recognized that it's not just an economic issue. It is a rising power, a long history, ambitions, the seek for hegemony, for dominance, quite clearly. And in this respect, we should have started to rethink our strategic options, I think 10 years earlier, and in closer cooperation with the United States. This disentanglement between the US and Europe in this respect was very harmful, and I hope we can overcome this. I really pledge for a very close transatlantic cooperation that plays out in many fields. In bringing in that what we can do better. We, as I mentioned, are not able to provide hard security, but we can release the pressure on the US, for example, in the Middle East or in the eastern and southeastern periphery of Europe. That is our turf, and we have to contribute to security. Things kind of labor sharing, what is expected in Washington, they will definitely focus on the Indo-Pacific region, despite what's going on now in the Ukraine. But the long-term strategy is quite clear and has not changed.
And maybe we could just reiterate the EPP, long-standing EPP commitments to multilateralism, including in trade, because it benefits everyone.
No, this is still true, and I'm absolutely against any kind of protectionism. Might it be introduced by this discussion on climate change and carbon border tax issue? We must be very careful to maintain the basics, and we have to strengthen international organizations such as WTO, which is in a bit in trouble. But the transatlantic relations have to be revived, and despite which party is reigning, I think all the American elites have really recognized that there is a need for a revival. And of course, a different strategic culture. The current crisis in Ukraine clearly shows that we have to learn a lot in a very short time. We have seen the facts and the signs, but we had not been willing in Europe to really acknowledge what is behind and how to adjust to this. And now we have it to learn the hard way.
Well, the world only becomes more and more interconnected, I think, and the tensions
to some
in one
extent,
place.
more interconnected, but the dangers of disentangling and deglobalize to some extent would hit Europe first. So we have no interest, and we have to stand up for a connected world, but it has to be by rules. It's not just the stronger party set the rules, it is on equal footing. And the other Asian nations are very much on our side. They can only lose if multilateralism will weaken. They are in a position that they rely on trust.
Well, this is standards
and really starting with the open lanes of communication. This is where Europe is engaging, also in the maritime security. This is a good decision, but we have to play this in different fields and strengthen those countries to be part in these efforts.
Well, maybe we'll just ask you before we finish the episode. We've talked about the Indo-Pacific, which is your particular background and expertise, but you're, of course, the policy director writ large at the Wilfred Martin Center for European Studies now. So what are your, more generally speaking, your goals, your priorities, things you're excited about in these coming weeks, coming months at the Martin Center?
Well, bringing first in the expertise I got over the last 15 years, I think Europe is at a starting point to conceptualize and really substantiate Asian policy in a broader understanding. The other field is digitalization, it's energy issues, the transformation issues. And in this respect, Asian nations can be a really good partner. The tremendous challenges those nations face are not less than us. And they are often very weak, so that makes transformation more difficult. They often rely on old paths of fossil energy. That is a huge field of exchange and increasing capacities. That's where Europe has a unique advantage.
And a big challenge there as well.
Too, but we haven't found the answers, but maybe together, and we should not rely only on one path. Asians might find a different way, and this is worse as well.
Well, and this is where these exchanges are even more invaluable. Good ideas as well as goods and services and people flow.
And it is in both directions. The times where we preach the world or have the superior concepts are gone. They are very aspiring nations, very talented young generation. I mentioned that in the very beginning. Those young generations, and we're talking about hundreds of millions of young people, they have to get an opportunity and to break down the cage in which they are caught for too long.
Well, Dr. Peter Hefele, Policy Director at the Wilfred Martin Center for European Studies, thanks so much for joining us today to talk about the Indo-Pacific. And we welcome you and look forward to working with you in the future. Thanks to all of our listeners. Check in with you next time on our next episode of the European People's Podcast.